All right, hey guys, and welcome back. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. It was very relaxing, and you took the break that you all deserve. And now we are ready to kick back up with To Kill a Mockingbird. So, for To Kill a Mockingbird, we actually will not be reading all of part two. We typically never fully read it in the classroom because it is the trial, and that is something you really need to be a part of. And so, we are going to watch most of part two. However, there are some important chapters that I still want you guys to look at and to read. Okay, so the chapter that we're going to be reading this week is we're just going to be looking at chapter 15. So what I want to do is I do want to kind of summarize chapters 12 through 14 for you so you kind of know what's going on in those chapters. Now, if you want to read those chapters, you are more than welcome to. We just will not be doing anything with them in class, okay? So, chapter 12 starts out the very beginning of part two. So, by this time, Jim has reached the age of 12 and he kind of starts telling Scout to stop bothering him and that she is acting more and more like a girl. But it's interesting because this is where he starts to encourage her to act like a girl. He was like, you can't keep doing things like this, Scout, act who you are. And so that's kind of showing us that Jim is kind of growing up a little bit and kind of becoming more of a man. Of what we would assume a man would be like in the 1930s. So at this point, Scout is very upset and she looks forward to Dill because Dill comes from Meridian, Mississippi for the summer. However, to Scout's disappointment, Dill will not be coming to Macomb this year. In chapter 12, he sends a letter saying that he has a new dad and he will be staying with his family in Meridian. So we know at this point that Dill has always been very mysterious about his family. He lies a lot about who his dad is, saying that he owns a railroad company and that he's a pilot and all these things. And so we can kind of assume that he doesn't really have a permanent father figure. And it sounds like his mom got remarried. So he wants to kind of live that family dream that he's always wanted to. Okay. To make matters even worse, though, for Scout, Atticus gets called away into session in the state legislature. So Atticus has to go and he has to travel to the state capitol every day for 2 weeks. So he's kind of out of the picture in chapter 12. And this is when Aunt Alexandra is going to be coming back in, which is why we read the Christmas chapter, okay? At the end of chapter 12, we have Calpurnia. She decides to take the kids to her church, which would be a color church, okay? And so originally the kids were just supposed to go to their own church, but Calpurnia was like, I know you too well. You're gonna get into trouble. You need to come with me. And so they go to First Purchase Church, which is actually called First Purchase because it was the first thing that the first earnings that the freed slaves had they used to buy the church, okay? And so everyone really welcomes the kids because they are Atticus Finch's family, and Tom Robinson, the man that he's going to be who Atticus is defending, is a member of First Purchase. However, there is one person that does not welcome him, and her name is Lula. Lula criticizes Calpurnia for bringing the kids to church, saying that they need to go to white church. But other than that, the congregation is very, very friendly. We meet Reverend Sykes, who is the pastor. He is a great man, welcomes the kids, and says that everyone really, really loves his dad there. And so during this service, we do learn a little bit more about Tom Robinson's wife, who is Helen Robinson. She now can't find work because of her husband is accused of rape. And so we learn that not only is Tom Robinson being affected by this allegation, but also his family as well. And he has kids. Okay, so after the service, this is when Scout learns that Tom Robinson has been accused by Bobby Yule, and she can't understand why anyone would believe what the Yules are saying because no one likes the Yules. When they get home from church, that's when they find Aunt Alexandra on the porch waiting for them. So we know a little bit about Aunt Alexandra. We know that she is very prim, proper, and vain. She does not believe that Atticus is doing the right thing for standing up for a black man. She says it's going against his raising. Okay, so in chapter 13, a quick summary is basically just Aunt Alexandra kind of imposing herself onto onto the Finch household. Okay. Atticus asked her to come in because he knows that the trial is about to get started and he wants kind of have an extra set of eyes on the kids. So Aunt Alexandra explains that she'll stay with the kids for a while to give them some type of feminine influence, right? Because they don't have a mom. Now, yes, they have Calpurnia, but Aunt Alexandra obviously is racist and she does not feel that Calpurnia equals that feminine influence that her niece and nephew need. Okay. So Maycomb gives her a pretty good welcome. Various ladies in the town bake her cakes and have her over for coffee and all of these stuff. And she's definitely fitting into that classic social life. Okay. Aunt Alexandra is extremely proud of the Finches, and she spends a lot of the time in chapter 13 discussing the characteristics of various family members in Maycomb. She talks about the family consciousness as being an integral part of life in Maycomb. And it's kind of funny because we learn that, they kind of had a lot of like incest in order to keep their line pure. Um, and so Atticus is trying to explain what that means to Scout, but Scout, is still too young, and so she doesn't really understand. Okay. And then that brings us to chapter 14. So for chapter 14, this is when we start learning a little bit more even about what the trial is going to be about. So we learn this is when Jim and Scout really start hearing a lot more whispers and glances wherever they go in town. One day, Scout even asks Atticus, what is rape? Remember, Scout is our young narrator. She doesn't know what rape is. And then they also talk about the fact that the kids went to Calpurnia's church. And Alexandra tells Scout that she could not go back to Calpurnia's church, obviously. We know that Atticus, she does, and Alexandra will try to convince Atticus to get rid of Calpurnia by saying that she's no longer needed. Obviously, Atticus refuses, right? Atticus loves Calpurnia and really depends on her heavily. Okay. Later that night, Jim does tell Scout not to bother Alexandra and that she's getting enough grief here and there. But Scout gets really angry at being lectured and kind of attacks Jim. And so we know that she likes to fight, right? She got into a fight with her cousin. And with Cecil Jacobs and Walter Cunningham, she beats up a lot of people. But she's never beat up Jim before. And so Atticus breaks up the fight and sends them to bed. What's interesting here is that Scout discovers that something is under her bed, and she calls Jim over like, hey, there's something that's not a snake under my bed. And then we discover that Dill has actually been hiding in their room. So Dill had run away from home because his mother and his new father didn't pay enough attention to him. So he took a train to Meridian, from Meridian to Maycomb, about 14 miles away, and covered the remaining distance on foot, and came into the Finch family house to hide out and kind of seek refuge. And so Jim goes down the hall and tells Atticus, which this is interesting because it does show us that Jim's loyalty is lying more with adults than it is lying with the kids. Okay, so we definitely see that he has already bridged that coming of age gap that we've been waiting for. Okay, Atticus also asks Scout to get more food from the pan other than cold cornbread for Dill before going next door to Dill's aunt, Mrs. Rachel, to let him know that, hey, Dill is safe. He's not, hiding somewhere else. So then Dill eats, he gets into Jim bed, and then soon climbs over to Scout's bed to talk about things. Okay, so that's basically where we are picking up with chapter 15. All right, so let's read chapter 15, and then we will have our synchronous session later. Okay. So it says, after many phone calls, much pleading on behalf of the defendant, and a long forgiving letter from his mother, it was decided that Dill could stay. We had a week of peace together. After that, little it seemed. A nightmare was upon us. It began one evening after supper. Dill was over, and Aunt Alexandra was in her chair in the corner. Atticus was in his, and Jim and I were on the floor reading. It had been a placid week. I had minded Auntie. Jim had outgrown the treehouse, but helped Dill and me construct a new rope ladder for it. And Dill had hit upon the foolproof plan to make Boo Radley come out at no cost to ourselves and place a trail of lemon drops from the back door to the front door, and he'd follow it like an ant. Okay, so Boo Radley is they're trying to still get that Boo Radley out. There was a knock on the front door, and Jim answered it, and he said it was Heck Tate. All right, so Heck Tate is the sheriff in town. We'll ask him to come in, said Atticus. I already did. There's some men outside in the yard. They want you to come out. In Maycomb, grown men stood outside in the front yard for only two reasons: death and politics. I wonder who had died. Jim and I went to the front door, but Atticus called, "Go back in the house." Jim turned out the living room lights and pressed his nose to a window screen. Aunt Alexandra protested. "Just for a second, Auntie. Let's see who it is," he said. Dill and I took another window. A crowd of men was standing around Atticus. They all seemed to be talking at once. "Moving him to the county jail tomorrow," Mr. Tate was saying. "I don't look for any trouble, but I can't guarantee there won't be any." "Don't be foolish, Heck," Atticus said. "This is Maycomb." Said I was just uneasy. "Heck, we've got one postponement of this case just to make sure there's nothing to be uneasy about. This is Saturday," Atticus said. "Trial probably being Monday. You can give him one night, can't you? I don't think anybody in Maycomb will begrudge me a client with times this hard." There was a murmur of glee that died suddenly when Mr. Link Diaz said, "Nobody around here is up to anything. It's that old Sarum bunch I'm worried about. Can't you get a what is it, Heck? What is it, Heck? Change of venue?" said Mr. Tate. "Not much point in that now, is it?" Atticus said something inaudible. I turned to Jim, who waved me to silence. "Besides," Atticus was saying, "you're not scared of that crowd, are you?" "No, know how they do when they get shinnied up. They don't usually drink on Sunday. They go to church most of the day," Atticus said. "This is a special occasion, though," somebody said. All right, so kind of to kind of brief what's happening here is the sheriff has come to say that Tom Robinson is being moved back to Maycomb for his trial, and he is worried that people are going to come and try to basically storm the jailhouse in order to hurt Tom before the trial starts. Okay, and so they're kind of warning Atticus that that is a possibility. They murmured and buzzed until Auntie said if Jim didn't turn on the living room lights, he'd be the disgrace of the family. Jim didn't hear her. "Don't see why you touch it in the first place," Mr. Link Diaz was saying. "You've got everything to lose from this, Atticus. I mean everything." "Do you really think so?" This was Atticus's dangerous question. "Do you really think you want to move there, Scout?" Bam, bam, bam. The checkerboard was swept clean of my men. "Do you really think that, son?" And Then read this. Jim would struggle the rest of the evening through the speeches of Henry W. Grady. "Link, that boy might go to the chair, and he is not going till the truth's told." Atticus' voice was even. "And you know what the truth is." So this is a very important distinction right here where it says, "Link, that boy might go to the chair." So he's referring to Tom Robinson here. And so the penalty for rape in the 1930s was automatic execution. Okay, so it's not like Tom Robinson is just going to jail for a couple years and then he'll get out. He will be sentenced to death. But what Atticus is saying, he's like, he's probably going to be sentenced to death, but I'm going to tell the truth and everyone's going to know what actually happened that night. There was a murmur among the group of men, made more ominous when Atticus moved back to the bottom front step and the men drew nearer to him. Suddenly, Jim screamed, "Atticus, the telephone's ringing!" The men jumped a little and scattered. There were people we saw every day, merchants, in-town farmers. Dr. Reynolds was there, and so was Mr. Avery. "Well, answer it, son," called Atticus. Laughter broke them up. When Atticus switched on the overhead light in the living room, he found Jim at the window, pale except for the vivid mark of the screen on his nose. "Why on earth are you all sitting in the dark?" he asked. Jim watched him go to his chair and pick up the evening paper. "I sometimes think Atticus subjected every crisis of his life to tranquil evaluation behind the Mobile Register, the Birmingham News, and the Montgomery Advertiser." "They were after you, weren't they?" Jim went to them. "They wanted to get you, didn't they?" Atticus lowered the paper and gazed at Jim. "What have you been reading?" he asked. And then he said gently, "No, son, those were our friends." "It wasn't a gang?" Jim was looking from the corners of his eyes. Atticus tried to stifle a smile, but didn't make it. No, we don't have mobs. And that nonsense in Macomb. I've never heard of a gang in Macomb. The Ku Klux got some Catholics one time. Never heard of any Catholics in Macomb either, said Atticus. You're confusing that with something else. Way back about 1920, there was a Klan, but it was a political organization more than anything. Besides, they couldn't find anybody to scare. They paraded by Mr. Sam Levy's house one night, but Sam stood on the porch and told them to come have a pretty pass. They'd stolen the very sheets on their back. Sam made him so ashamed of themselves they went away. The Levy family met all the criteria for being fine folks. They did their best they could with the sense they had, and they had been living on the same plot of ground in Macomb for 5 generations. The Ku Klux is gone, said Atticus. It'll never come back. I walked home with Dill and returned in time to overhear Atticus saying to Auntie, in favor of Southern womanhood as much as anybody, but not for preserving polite fiction at the expense of human life. A pronouncement that made me suspect that they had been fussing again. I sought Jim and found him in his room on the bed deep in thought. Have they been at it? I asked. Sort of. She won't let him alone about Tom Robinson. She almost said Atticus was disgracing the family. Scout, I'm scared. Scared of what? Scared about Atticus. Somebody might hurt him. Jim preferred to remain mysterious. All he could say to my questions was go on and leave him alone. Next day was Sunday. In the interval between Sunday school and church, when the congregation stretched its legs, I saw Atticus standing in the yard with another knot of men. Mr. Hectate was present, and I wondered if he had seen the light. He never went to church. Even Mr. Underwood was there. Mr. Underwood had no use for any organization but the Macon Tribune, of which he was the sole owner, editor, and printer. His days were spent at his linotype, where he refreshed himself occasionally from an ever-present gallon jug of cherry wine. He rarely gathered news. People brought it to him. It was said that he made up every edition of the Macon Tribune out of his own head and wrote it down on the linotype. This was believed. Something must have been up to haul Mr. Underwood out. I caught Atticus coming to the door, and he said that he had moved Tom Robinson to the Macomb jail. He also said, more to himself than to me, that if he had kept him there in the first place, there wouldn't have been any fuss. I watched him take his seat on the third row from the front, and I heard him rumble, Nearer, my God, to thee, some notes behind the rest of us. He never sat with Auntie Jim and me. He liked to be by himself in church. The fake peace that prevailed on Sundays was made more irritating by Aunt Alexandra's presence. Atticus would flee to his office directly after dinner, where if we sometimes looked in on him, we would find him sitting back in his swivel chair reading. Aunt Alexandra composed herself for a 2-hour nap and dared us to make any noise in the yard. The neighborhood was resting. Jim, in his old age, had taken to his room with a stack of football magazines. So Dill and I spent our Sundays creeping around in deer pasture. Shooting on Sundays was prohibited, so Dill and I kicked Jim's football around the pasture for a while. This was no fun. Dill asked if I'd like to have a poke at Boo Radley. I said I didn't think it'd be nice to bother him, and spent the rest of the afternoon filling Dill in on the last winter's events. He was considerably impressed. We parted at supper time, and after our meal, Jim and I were settling down to our routine evening. When Atticus did something that interested us, he came in the living room carrying a long electrical extension cord. There was a light bulb at the end. I'm going out for a while, he said. You folks will be in bed when I come back, so I'll say goodnight now. With that, he put his hat on and went out the back door. He's taken the car, said Jim. Our father had few peculiarities. One was he never ate desserts. Another was that he liked to walk. As far back as I can remember, there was always a Chevrolet in excellent condition in the car house, and Atticus put many miles on it in business trips, but Macomb he walked to and from his office 4 times a day, covering about 2 miles. He said his only exercise was walking. In Maycomb, if one went for a walk with no definite purpose in mind, it was correct to believe one's mind incapable of definite purpose. Later on, I bade my aunt and brother good night and was well into a book when I heard Jim rattling around in his room. His go-to-bed noises were so familiar to me that I knocked on his door. "Why you ain't going to bed?" "I'm going downtown for a while." He was changing his pants. "Why? It's almost 10 o'clock, Jim." He knew it, but he was going anyway. "Well, then I'm going with you. And if you say no, you're not, I'm coming anyway. I'm going anyway. Here." Jim saw that he would have to fight me to keep me home, and I suppose he thought a fight would antagonize Auntie, so he gave in with little grace. I dressed quickly, and we waited until Auntie's light went out, and we walked quietly down the back steps. There was no moon tonight. "Dill will want to come," I whispered. "So he will," said Jim gloomily. We leaped over the driveway wall, cut through Mrs. Rachel's side yard, and went to Dill's window. Jim whistled Bob White. Dill's face appeared at the screen and disappeared, and 5 minutes later he unhooked the screen and crawled out. An old campaigner, he did not speak until we were on the sidewalk. "What's up?" "Jim's got the look arounds," an affliction Calpurnia said all boys caught at his age. "I just got this feeling," uh, Jim said. "Just this feeling." We went by Mrs. DeBoe's house standing empty and shuttered, her camellias grown up in weeds and Johnson grass. There were 8 more houses to the post office corner. The south side of the square was deserted. Giant monkey puzzle bushes bristled on each corner, and between them an iron hitching rail glistened under the streetlights. A light shone in on the county toilet, otherwise the side of the courthouse was dark. A larger square of stores surrounded the courthouse square, and dim lights burned from deep within them. Atticus's office was in the courthouse when he began his law practice, but after several years of it, he moved to quieter quarters in the Birmingham Bank building. When we rounded the corner of the square, we saw the car parked in front of the bank. "He's in there," said Jim. But he wasn't. His office was reached by a long hallway. Looking down the hallway, we should have seen Atticus Finch, attorney at law, in small silver letters against the light from behind the door. It was dark. Jim peered in the bank door to make sure. He turned the knob. The door was locked. "Let's go up the street. Maybe he's visited Mr. Underwood." Mr. Underwood not only ran the Macon Tribune office, he lived in it. That is, above it. He covered the courthouse and the jailhouse news simply by looking out his upstairs window. The office building was on the northwest corner of the square, and we reached it if we would pass the jail. The Macomb jail was the most venerable and hideous of all county buildings. Atticus said it was something like Cousin Joshua St. Clair might have designed. It was certainly someone's dream. Starkly out of place in a town of square-faced stores and steep-roofed houses, the Macomb jail was a miniature Gothic joke, 1 cell wide and 2 cells high, complete with tiny battlements of flying boostresses. Its fantasy was heightened by its red brick facade and the thick steel bars and its classical windows. It stood on no lonely hill, but was wedged between Tynald's hardware store and the Macomb Tribune office. The jail was Macomb's only conversation piece. Its detractors said it looked like a Victorian privy. Its supporters said it gave the town a good, solid, respectable look, and no stranger would ever suspect that it was full of Negroes. As we walked up the sidewalks, we saw a solitary light burning in the distance. "That's funny," said Jim. The jail doesn't have an outside light." "Looks like it's over the door," said Dill. A long extension cord ran behind the bars on the second floor window and down the side of the building. In the light from its bare bulb, Atticus was sitting propped against the front door. He was sitting in one of his office chairs. He was reading, oblivious to the night bugs dancing over his head. It made me run, but Jim caught me. "Don't go to him," he said. He might not like it. He's all right. Let's go home. I just wanted to see where he was. We were taking a short cut across the square when 4 dusty cars came in from Meridian Highway, moving slowly in a line. They went around the square, past the bank building, and stopped in front of the jail. Nobody got out. We saw Atticus look up from his paper, and he closed it, folded it deliberately, and dropped it on his lap, and pushed his hat to the back of his head. He seemed to be expecting them. Come on, whispered Jim. We streaked across the square and across the street until we were in the shelter of the Jitney Jungle door. Jim peeked up the sidewalk. We can get closer, he said. We ran to Tynell's hardware door, near enough at the same time discreet. In ones and twos, men got out of the cars. Shadows became substances as the light revealed solid shapes moving towards the jail door. Atticus remained where he was. The men hid him from view. He in there, Mr. Finch? A man said. He is, we heard Atticus answering. He's asleep. Don't wake him. So they're talking about Tom Robinson here. In obedience to my father, there followed what I later realized was a sickeningly comic aspect of the unfunny situation. The men talked in near whispers. You know what we want, another man said. Get aside from the door, Mr. Finch. You can turn around and go home again, Walter, Atticus said pleasantly. Heck Tate's round here somewhere. The hell he is, said another man. Heck's bunch so deep in the woods they won't get out till morning. Indeed? Why so? Called him off on a snipe hunt, was the succinct answer. Didn't you think of that, Mr. Finch? Thought about it. Didn't believe it. Well then, my father's voice was still the same. That changes things, doesn't it? It do, another deep voice said. Its owner was a shadow. Do you really think so? This was the second time I heard Atticus ask that question in 2 days, and it meant somebody's man would get jumped. This was too good to miss. I broke away from Jim and ran as fast as I could to Atticus. Jim screeched and tried to catch me, but I had a lead on him and Dill. I pushed my way through the dark, smelly bodies and burst into the circle of light. Hey, Atticus! I thought he would have a fine surprise, but his face killed my joy. The flash of plain fear was going out of his eyes, but returned when Dill and Jim wriggled into the light. There was a smell of stale whiskey and pigpen about, and when I glanced around, I discovered that these men were strangers. They were not the people I saw last night. Hot embarrassment shot through me. I led triumphantly into a ring of people I had never seen before. Atticus got up from his chair, but he was moving slowly, like an old man. He put the newspaper down very carefully, adjusting the creases with lingering fingers. They were trembling a little. Go home, Jim, he said. Take Scout and Dill home. We were accustomed to prompt, if not always cheerful, acquiescence to Atticus's instructions, but from the way he stood, Jim was not thinking of budging. Go home, I said. Jim shook his head. As Atticus's fist went to his hips, so did Jim's. And as they faced each other, I could see a little resemblance between them. Jim's soft brown hair and eyes and his oval face, snug fit ears were of my mother's, contrasting oddly with Atticus's graying black hair and square cut features. But they were alike somehow. Mutual defiance made them alike. Son, I said go home. Jim shook his head. I'll send him home, a burly man said, and grabbed Jim roughly by the collar. He yanked Jim nearly off his feet. Don't you touch him! I kicked the man swiftly. Barefooted, I was surprised to see him fall back in real pain. I intended to kick his shin, but I aimed too high. That'll do, Scout. Atticus put his hand on my shoulder. Don't kick folks. No, he said, as if he was, as I was pleading justification. Ain't nobody gonna do Jim that way, I said. All right, Mr. Finch, get him out of here, someone growled. You got 15 seconds to get him out of here. In the midst of this strange assembly, Atticus stood trying to make Jim mind him. I ain't going, was his steady answer to Atticus's threats, requests, and finally, please, Jim, take them home. I was getting a bit tired of that, but felt Jim had his own reasons for doing as he did, in view of his prospects once Atticus did get him home. I looked around the crowd. It was a summer's night, but the men were dressed, most of them in overalls and denim shirts buttoned up to the collars. I thought they must be cold-natured, as the sleeves were unrolled and buttoned down to the cuffs. Some wore hats pulled firmly down over their ears. They were sullen-looking, sleepy-eyed men who seemed unused to late hours. I sought once more for a familiar face, and at the center of the semicircle, I found one. Hey, Mr. Cunningham! The man did not answer, or did not hear me, it seemed. Hey, Mr. Cunningham! How's your entailment getting along? Mr. Walter Cunningham's legal affairs were well known to me. Atticus had once described them at length. The big man blinked, hooked his thumb in his overall straps. He seemed uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and looked away. My friendly overturn had fallen flat. Mr. Cunningham wore no hat, and the top half of his forehead was white in contrast to his sun-scorched face, which led me to believe that he wore one most days. He shifted to his feet, clad in heavy work shoes. Don't you remember me, Mr. Cunningham? I'm Jean Louise Finch. You bought us some hickory nuts one time, remember? I began to sense the futility one feels when unacknowledged by a chance acquaintance. I go to school with Walter, I began again. He's your boy, ain't he? Ain't he, sir? Mr. Cunningham was moved to a faint nod. He did know me after all. He's in my grade, I said. He does right well. He's a good boy, I added. A real nice boy. We brought him home for dinner one time. Maybe he told you about me. I beat him up one time, but he was real nice about it. Tell him hey for me, won't you? Atticus said it was the polite thing to talk to people about what they were interested in, not about what you were interested in. Mr. Cunningham displayed no interest in his son, so I tackled his entailment once more at a last-ditch effort to make him feel at home. Entailments are bad, I was advising him, when I slowly awoke to the fact that I was addressing the entire aggregation. The men were all looking at me. Some had their mouths half open. Atticus had stopped poking at Jim. They were standing together beside Dill. Their attention amounted to fascination. Atticus's mouth, even, was half open, an attitude he had once described as uncouth. Our eyes had met, and he shut it. Well, Atticus, I was just saying to Mr. Cunningham that entailments are bad and all that, but you said not to worry. It just takes a long time sometimes. That you all write it out together. I was slowly drying up, wondering what idiocy I had committed. Entailment seemed all right enough for a living room talk. I began to feel sweat gathering at the edges of my hair, and I could stand anything but a bunch of people looking at me. They were quite still. What's the matter? I asked. Atticus said nothing. I looked around and up at Mr. Cunningham, whose face was equally impassive. Then he did a peculiar thing. He squatted down and took me by both shoulders. I'll tell him you said, hey, little lady, he said. And then he straightened up and waved a big paw. Let's clear out, he called. Let's get going, boys. As they had come in ones and twos, the men shuffled back to their ramshackle cars. Doors slammed, engines coughed, and they were gone. I turned to Atticus, but Atticus had gone to jail and was leaning against it with his face to the wall. I went to him and pulled his sleeve. Can we go home now? He nodded, produced his handkerchief, and gave his face a going over and blew his nose violently. Mr. Finch. A soft, husky voice came from the darkness above. They gone? Atticus stepped back and looked up. They've gone, he said. Get some sleep, Tom. They won't bother you any more. From a different direction, another voice cut crisply through the night. You're damn tootin' they won't. Had you covered all the time, Atticus. Mr. Underwood had a double-barreled shotgun were leaning out of his window above the Macon Tribune office. It was long past my bedtime, and I was growing quite tired. It seemed that Atticus and Mr. Underwood would have talked for the rest of the night. Mr. Underwood out the window and Atticus up at him. Finally, Atticus returned and switched off the light above the jail door and picked up his chair. Can I carry it for you, Mr. Finch? Said Dill. He had not said a word the whole time. Why, thank you, son. Walking towards the office, Dill and I fell into step behind Atticus and Jim. Dill was encumbered by the chair, and his pace was slower. Atticus and Jim were well ahead of us, and I assumed that Atticus was giving him hell for not going home. But I was wrong. As they passed under a streetlight, Atticus reached out and massaged Jim's hair, his one gesture of affection. All right, so a very, very scary moment for Atticus, right? These men had come and they were going to either kill or severely injure Tom Robinson in hopes that it would kind of make him not be able to do the trial, because we know that no one wants to have this trial go on, right? They are very angry that the court is even calling this a trial because it is a black man against a white man or white woman. And so they're like, why is this not clear cut? And so they wanted to kind of end it before it started. And Atticus went to protect Tom even before the trial even started. Now, it was a lot of Scout's innocence that really saved the day here, and we're going to be talking about that in our synchronous session. Okay. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Talk soon. Bye.